So hello, and thank you for joining this session of the McGill Executive Institute's Level Up webinar series. My name is Eric Sain, Director of the Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. I see we have people from around Canada, and we usually have a few people joining in from other countries as well. So bienvenue, welcome. Although you'll be on mute today, we want this to be a very interactive session. So feel free to submit your comments and questions by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Also, for better video viewing, we ask that you turn your own video off, and you can do that by clicking Stop Video in the lower left corner. The session will last 1 hour and include time to answer your questions. It'll also be recorded and shared with you afterwards. So we're very proud to welcome your webinar leader for today, Matissa Hollister. Matissa is a professor of organizational behavior here at McGill University, and she's a specialist in career trends and HR analytics. You'll also be joined today by Pam Sorrenti. She's our Director of Public Programs, and she'll be moderating today's session. So again, thank you all for attending. And with that, let's get started. Over to you, Matissa.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about something that's so near and dear to my heart. Just a little bit more about me. As Eric mentioned, I'm a professor at Des Hotels in organizational behavior. And in addition to teaching and researching in these areas, I've also spent the last year as a fellow with the World Economic Forum, leading a project where we're creating a practical guide on the use of AI in HR. And I'll be talking a little bit about that at the end of the presentation, although the presentation is really all about the lessons that I've learned in the project. We want this to be somewhat interactive. We'll start in a second with an interactive aspect. I, though, will probably keep my chat closed. Pam's in charge of monitoring that just because otherwise I think I'll get a little too distracted, but really want to encourage people to have a discussion in the chat, even if I'm not actively monitoring it. So to get that interaction started, we have our first question. And as Pam had pointed out, this is not a question to put in the chat. She's going to launch a poll. And we're asking two different questions because they're not mutually exclusive. You could see both great opportunities and perils, maybe one or the other. We're interested in your thoughts. So there's two parts. I think if you scroll down, you'll see two different questions. Do you see a lot of perils? Do you see a lot of opportunities?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Matissa. And we have started getting some responses already. We're about 27%, so we'll give it just a second as people navigate the two questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
And this is along the themes of the paradox, right? How can it be that AI offers both opportunities and perils?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I think everyone's getting the point about those questions. So great. So we have about 60%. So I'm going to end it there. And I'm going to share those results. So the majority, 42% of people rated an 8 for question 1, which is I see great opportunities in using AI to do HR tasks. So that's great. And for question 2, which is I see great perils in using HR to do HR tasks, we're around the 5-6 mark. For a total of 42%. So, and then there's some outliers as well.
Yeah,
so I'll stop
That's
sharing.
really interesting. So not as many people really worried about AI as I thought, which is quite interesting. We'll see whether we should have done a post survey whether I change your mind in one direction or another. So what I'm going to share here are 3 lessons that I've learned in my work on AI and HR. That AI is not magic, that AI risks encoding the status quo, and that opportunities require human innovation and collaboration. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the AI for HR project and where that's going. Excuse me. So lesson 1, AI is not magic. or even very intelligent. And I really am on a mission to ensure that everyone understand the basic principle that underlies today's AI, because it's actually not that hard to grasp. And I think it really helps you understand both the opportunities and the risks. So the first thing to put out there is good news. We're not heading in this direction anytime soon. So even the most advanced AI researchers think that they're not sure when we're going to get to the point where we're going to have computers that are smarter and equally capable as humans. But there's an agreement that it's at least 10 years. Most people think 30 years. And I'm somewhat in the camp that the current use of AI, I think it's going to need a completely different approach. I'm not sure that we're going to reach true intelligence. And so right now, most AI systems are much narrower than this. And we'll see a little bit why in a minute, but they're really focused on operating in a specific environment. And the key thing is that they can't learn abstract lessons. They can't take lessons from one situation and apply it to another like a human can. So they can be very good if given the right training and doing a specific task, but they're not really intelligent in the way we think of true intelligence. So current AI is machine learning. So all of the hype and interest that you've heard about AI in the last 10 years or so has really been due to advancements in machine learning. And machine learning is kind of a general type of approach. There's a variety of different sub-approaches within that. But what they all share in common is two things, is this approach where they start by looking at real world examples and looking for patterns in those examples. And you need a lot of examples, which is part of the reason why AI has taken off. Some of these ideas about AI existed in the 70s and 80s, but they didn't have enough data or computing power to do it. But now we have a lot of big data, we have the computers to do it, and we've had some methodological advances as well. So we're looking for the patterns, and then we're using these patterns to predict or act on new cases. And I'll show a little bit more how that works in a second. And within that suite of machine learning, there's often referred to as 3 different types, and then I'm adding in a 4th category. So the first type is supervised machine learning, and really the main defining aspect of supervised machine learning is it's trying to predict an outcome. So it has a particular outcome in mind, and we'll see more about that in a moment. The second type is unsupervised machine learning, which when I first heard about it, thought it sounded more magical. My students recently had the same thought, but it's not really. What unsupervised machine learning is really about grouping similar things together, finding clumps and clusters of similar items. The third type of machine learning is reinforcement learning, which I often describe as the teenager learning how to play a video game. You try something, you see what happens when you open this door, and then you die. And then you start over again and you try something else, and then you die. And you get a little further each time and you figure out the best path. So that's behind some of the AI you've heard about being successful in learning how to play Go and to do other types of activities like that. But you need the circumstances where the machine can actually try and fail numerous times. I'm creating a 4th category here, image and text, because that's where we've seen the biggest advancements. And so image recognition, natural language processing, speech and text are usually based upon supervised machine learning, but they often have some specialized, like there's people who really focus in on images and language. And so there's sort of specialized tools. So you'll even see many times when an AI tool incorporates natural language processing or images, they might even subcontract to somebody that specializes in that. So that there's been a lot of advancement specifically in that area. So within HR and actually generally, I would say the large majority, but not all of AI based tools are using supervised machine learning. Occasionally, if you can't figure out that there's an outcome, chances are it's using unsupervised machine learning. It's just finding things that are similar. But most of the time, it's about targeting an outcome. So we're going to focus in on that. So the way that it works is that I said that the tool learns from real world examples. So like we call that training data. And I always put historical training data in the label because almost always that training data is coming from past examples. And what we need in the training data is some sort of inputs and an outcome. And I'll explain a little bit more. We'll give an example of what that might look like in a second. And what machine learning is about is looking for patterns that link the inputs to the outcome. So what are combinations of certain inputs that are correlated with the outcome? And the outcome could either be a quantitative score, higher or lower values of something, or it could be categorizing something. So we have a bunch of different categories, and what are the inputs that are related to being in this category or that category? And so once we see those patterns, then what happens is when we deploy the tool, we have new cases where all we have is the inputs. We don't know what the outcome is. And so we're taking the patterns that we've identified in our historical training data to then predict what the outcome will be in the new case. So an example, and I'll explain, and we'll see in a minute why it's not such a great example, but this would be sort of a classic approach, probably the first thing people thought of, which is let's use AI to choose the best job applicants. So let's think through the steps that we would need to do to build such a model. The first thing we need to do is we need to find training data. We would need to be relevant training data. So it would have to be something, I talked about how the system is not learning abstract lessons. It can't learn lessons and apply it to a new context. So the training data has to be very similar to the context, or at least the patterns that are identified have to be applicable to the context in which you're going to be deploying it. The second thing, so in our case of hiring, probably our training data will be the past people that we've hired. One of the questions that you're going to face, we said we needed a lot of examples. So how are we going to get a lot of examples? So the first question is, even within your organization, is the job, do you have enough people that you've hired in the past that you have a lot of examples for a specific job? Or are you going to look at things that apply across all the jobs that you hire? Or your other option is to pool across companies. And sometimes that's actually the advantage that a vendor may give, is that they have accumulated data across companies. But of course, there's considerations there, both data privacy considerations, as well as are the contexts in the companies that you're now pooling with going to be applicable to the place where you're going to be deploying. The next thing within that training data, we have a bunch of examples. What do we need inside those examples? We need a measurable outcome. So sometimes you'll see in the website of a tool, we identify high performing workers, or the high capacity, high potential workers. Well, you actually have to define what does that mean, and you have to have it in a quantitative, measurable way. So most of the time when these tools are focusing on identifying kind of high potential workers or something like that, it means they're having some sort of measure of performance. And that raises interesting questions, right? We all know how challenging and imperfect our employee performance measures are. We know that it doesn't take into account everything. So we know ahead of time, this tool will be single-mindedly focused on predicting and maximizing performance or the outcome, however we measure it. And if that outcome doesn't measure everything that we think is relevant, then we as humans need to bring in that part, because the system will not be taking that into account. And then we need the inputs. So we need to decide what inputs are relevant and can we measure them, and how are we going to measure them. And that could be a big challenge. And it's often the objection I hear from people is, well, we couldn't possibly capture everything that's relevant for hiring. So what we might do is just take everything that we have about the applicant when they come in, right? So those inputs have to be the inputs that we'll have when we deploy it. So it has to be only characteristics of the applicants before we hire them, so that we can predict ahead of time whether or not we think they're going to be good hires. And then we deploy our machine learning algorithm. It tries to identify what combinations of characteristics are related to higher or lower performance once they're hired. And then when we go to deploy it, we're going to use those patterns to then predict who's going to be a high performing or low performing employee once we hire them. So that would be the idea. What's the goal? Well, there's a couple of goals usually we have for these types of models. The first, of course, is speed and volume. The computer can, once set up, can do this much faster than a human. Most people are often interested in this aspect. Those of you who have spent time reviewing resumes know how challenging it can be. There's some statistics that are thrown around that the average resume is only looked at for 6 seconds. So maybe it's actually slightly more thorough review of all resumes, because it can process a lot of information very fast. We hope that it's going to be highly accurate in predicting the outcome. But as a warning, it's unlikely. And the thing to think about here is a couple of things. Unlike the success that AI has had for things like image and speech, there's a couple of things going on. One is that input question, right? Can we actually measure everything that's relevant for knowing how someone's going to perform in the future? Is it really possible for us to provide the system with all the relevant information? The other thing is that we're also talking about predicting into the future, right? So it's one thing to say, what is the picture that's right in front of you, what's in the picture? But if we're talking about who's going to be a high performer in the future, there's all kinds of factors that we're not going to be able to account for. Random events, whether or not two coworkers get along, all kinds of things like that we can't really fully predict. So we're never in future human outcomes. I always tell my students, never expect an algorithm to be highly, highly predictive. But the other thing to think about is chances are the human is not highly predictive either. I don't think any of us would say, even once we choose people who we hire, that we know for absolute sure that they're going to be a great employee, right? This is part of the challenge of hiring, is that it's an unknown. And we're making our best guess. And so, some people would argue that the benchmark shouldn't be that it should be highly predictive in predicting the outcome, but it should just be equal or better than the human in predicting the outcome. And that's where it can be a little bit ambiguous. But there's this expectation that somehow, because the computer is doing it, suddenly it's going to be super highly predictive. And chances are it won't be for this kind of broad application. And then the other hope is that it might uncover hidden patterns. So it might do things that the human maybe hasn't noticed. And there is some chance of that. Let's say that you have tended to assume that you need a master's degree for this job. But sometimes you've hired people who didn't have a master's degree. The machine learning algorithm could identify, hey, you know what? You've been making this assumption that these things are necessary for high performance, but actually, if we look back at the past examples, that's not actually what predicts performance. And so it might end up finding patterns and important things and improving on the decision-making over what you've been doing in the past. But there may be a danger and problem to that. So here is why I suggested that this may not be the absolute best example. In 2018, there was a big news story. This is cited almost any time someone talks about the dangers of AI. Amazon tried to build a tool that looked pretty much like I described. And after a couple of years, at least they tested it and they discovered that it would seem to be discriminating against women. And they tried to fix it, and eventually they couldn't fix it and they abandoned the whole thing. And so before I tell you what I think, we had this question here to put in the chat. What do you think went wrong? Or have you seen similar examples of tools going wrong? So now we encourage you to put things in the chat.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know from the audience if they've tried to, implement any of these.
So far,
how it went.
Yeah.
So a couple answers. We have education can bias, which is true. So I think that, the overall idea there is biases in general. Guys were developing it. So,
yeah.
Meaning, yeah, exactly. It was men developing it, and it was based on, previous hiring trends, experiences overlooked. So I mean, all of those speak to probably what happened. And yes, there's, more about bias patterns in your data will be repeated by the algorithm.
Yeah.
So maybe, one thing is, how can you avoid those biases, those bias patterns? How can you test yourself and your algorithms?
Yeah, so I think I like the point about the guys developing it. So there are people who are pushing for more diverse developing teams. And of course, that's not a guarantee, right? And in fact, research has shown that we all hold implicit biases even against ourselves, right? That we have expectations by gender. There's a great study of science professors where they sent anonymous resumes, and even the female scientists thought that the male lab assistants were better. So it's not a guarantee with a diverse team, but I think it's more likely that a diverse development team will catch on to some of these factors. It's interesting, the point that somebody put, I did open up the chat about removing the names. So interestingly, the names were not in here. What can happen, and I'll show you in a second, is that these are what are called proxy variables, which means that even if you take out the names, so that the gender or anything that would actually identify the groups, if the groups are correlated, so that there's more men tend to have this characteristic, women tend to have this characteristic. If the company prefers, let's say, it was based on past hiring that was hugely discriminatory, which is not the case here. We'll talk about in a second. But let's say in the past they were completely discriminatory. They said no women allowed. Even if they removed any information, direct information about the gender of the candidate, the tool the tool is looking to kind of replicate the past patterns. And so the tool would look for anything that was correlated with gender and would use that as a proxy for gender. So if it was very true that Amazon didn't want to hire women, it could look for things we were going to talk about, like, did you play football, right? Because that's highly correlated with gender. Do you say that you were part of the parent-teacher association? Because that might be slightly correlated with being a woman, right? These various things that if there's any correlation, it can recreate and it can kind of guess at people's issue things. Yeah, so these proxy variables are a big issue, because it means that it's not just as simple as removing the information about individuals.
Right, the names. And there was a comment about, the lack of experience potentially a woman might have, due to having children, for example. And so you could see how a gap in your CV because of, pregnancies or maternity leaves, a lack of progression in your career because you've stepped away to have children could impact that as well, I would imagine.
Yeah. And so this is a big challenge, right? Which is that is a reflection of what we would call sort of historic or society-wide trends in outcomes. So there we end up in this interesting, challenging area, which are the factors that the organization is responsible for addressing, and which of the factors are sort of so broad in society that is it the organization's responsibility to take people who have less experience if women tend to have less work experience because they've taken time off for having children, right? So it's an interesting question which is, where does the line draw of what's fair and not fair, right? And I'll talk some about some of my thoughts on it, but I don't have the perfect answer for that. And the other question that I see being put in here is about sort of, does it remove, is it sort of fair to use AI to evaluate candidates? is it taking away all the human aspects? And I think that is the question. Interestingly, Google did a similar tool, ended up with a positive outcome, which was that the tool was recommended more diverse candidates than the humans were doing. And some of that has to do with, I think they had a broader diversity of examples, and that was that case of the machine identifying kind of quote hidden patterns, which was that the machine was showing like, oh, actually those few times you took a risk and hired candidates with unusual backgrounds, those candidates worked out quite well. So it was shifting the hiring practices towards fairer practices. And the question of whether or not the AI can capture aspects of human interaction, I think that definitely feeds into this accuracy question, right? Can it actually be accurate? But I mean, some of it is also where you're doing it in the stage, right? Because much of 90% of people are screened out in the resume, on the resume screening stage, where there's not a lot of human interaction involved anyway. And so if we're talking about using a machine learning to kind of replicate that stage, it may capture just as much subtlety as the human does in evaluating a resume on paper, because you're making a decision based on the same just pieces of information on a paper. But I think there's a debate about whether or not these tools can capture what we would think of as human intuition or not.
And I'm not sure if you saw it, but there was another question. When is AI a best return on investment to identify skill over demographics?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. Maybe let's return to that if we feel like it hasn't been answered. Okay. And we'll see whether we get. I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer that question directly, but I think we can give it more context with a couple more points here.
Perfect. Okay.
So would I think of the Amazon example as a great example of how AI risks encoding the status quo? And I like to tell people, right, that AI is a strange paradox of being a cutting edge technology that relies on the past to create its patterns. And so this is not just about bias. So the Amazon example is obviously about learning bias, but it's also about its inability to identify and potentially offer improvements to the organization. And so I think this is the big caution here. So in my view, there's a couple of things that went wrong, and a number of them you guys have already pointed out, right? So one is training data composition. They had a lot more men traditionally in the past who had been applied to the job and had been hired in the job. And so the pattern, the algorithm was potentially going to capture these aspects like maybe being an athlete is an interesting qualification, but it may end up choosing to look only at did you play football, when maybe we want to broaden that to being an athlete. And I did see briefly somebody saying, like, is it fair to consider extracurriculars? Maybe we should just take those out. And that very well might reduce that problem of proxy variables. But there are people, I mean, one of the reasons why we put that in there is we feel like somehow those extracurriculars give us some sort of insight into other aspects of the person's skills or interests. But I think that, there are some tools, and this is an interesting thing that I would highlight, these vendor tools that we'll get to, each one is taking, like, I think of them as snowflakes, right? Like every one has a slightly different take. And some of the tools out there are doing this thing of saying, like, let's really, really narrow in on skills. And we're going to, forget extracurriculars, forget all of this. All we're going to do is assess, do you have the exact skill that's listed on the job description as being required, right? And that might be a way to deal with it. The second, as people sort of said, it is a little bit garbage in, garbage out, and that's always a good sort of heuristic, but kind of zooming in a little bit more, right? It's the challenge. The power of AI is machine learning is its reliance on real world data, because it's capturing, the real world combinations and subtleties and outcomes. It's not just doing kind of some sort of very bureaucratic rules-based system, but that means that those real world data incorporates all kinds of problems, and we can think about the problems as being both problems in the outcome and in the input. So if we think about the inputs, this is this challenge of proxy variables and all of those kinds of things. In terms of the outcome, there's a couple of possibilities here. One is that we do know that some outcomes, if they're subjective, that they themselves might incorporate bias. I always tell my students that we get evaluated based on student-teacher evaluations, and there's quite a bit of research that shows that, and in fact, they did some where they sort of anonymously in an online course changed the name of the teaching assistant, and the male teaching assistant got better course evaluations, right? So what we think of as being subjective performance reviews, it may just reflect problems in the performance evaluation process, or maybe the performance evaluation, the performance is measuring performance and women are actually performing worse, but maybe because it's a hostile work environment, or it's a there's certain supports that the organization could provide in terms of parental support and things that disproportionately affect women. And so in the short run, the algorithm was correct maybe in saying, if you want the highest performing people in the organization, you should hire more men, right? So this gets to the point that what the algorithm is looking at is it's finding the best combination of what's been tried before. So in that Google example, they had occasionally taken chances on other things. And so some of those past things that have been tried actually helped identify new patterns. But if you've never tried something, if you've always required a bachelor's degree for this job, the algorithm will not consider things that you've never tried before. So that also means it'll be challenging for unusual or unique or people that you've never hired before. It won't know what to do with those people. The other thing is, and this is the key, I think, in the Amazon example, is that it assumes that the context won't change, right? So this is this kind of, it's correct in the short run that the best person to hire, if you don't plan to change the organization, is to hire more men. But what it doesn't tell you is, hey, maybe if you change the way you set things up, and if you made a few small changes, you could have better outcomes for everybody, right? And you might get even further forward. So that's where my concern about the AI encoding the status quo. This is not just about encoding bias, but also just it's finding the best option of both what you've tried in the past and making the assumption that the context is not going to change, right? So now that I've been quite pessimistic, those are all the risks, where do the AI opportunities come from? And my argument is that it's really the collaboration between AI and human innovation that it has the highest opportunities. And so these are a couple of key points that I'm going to be highlighting. I think actually narrower machine learning is more innovative, that it requires collaboration with subject matter experts. It also requires collaboration with the users and those who are impacted. And a big lesson that I learned is about explainability. So we'll get to each of these points. The first on narrower but more innovative. What I'm going to show you is some ideas of what I mean. And these all come from tools that I've seen. And I'm not telling you what the tools are because I am not endorsing the tools. I don't think that I haven't evaluated their whole package. I don't think that they're necessarily the perfect tool, but these are things that catch my eye. I'm thinking like, they're using this in a much more targeted way. They're thinking about what they see as a problem in the human process. And they're targeting it. And the one thing actually I should have mentioned in the previous section is some people in the project I was involved with feel very passionately, all of these problems with the AI system also apply to the human decision making, right? We're not very good at predicting what's going to happen in the future. We base our decisions on gut instinct and what we've seen in the past. We maybe are a little bit better at thinking about how we might change the context, right? So it's not so much the problem with AI is not so much that it's going to be worse than the human processes. The problem is that it creates this illusion that somehow we become more objective when we solve the problem when it really hasn't. Okay, so these examples of what catches my eye as interesting. One is a tool where rather than just dumping everything that's in the resume into a tool and predicting performance, they've decided we're going to really narrow down. But in their case, they're looking at these behavioral characteristics. And the reason why they chose them was because they had seen previous academic research that had shown that these particular characteristics and how they were measured were similar across social groups. So I think one example of what they measure is impulsiveness, right? And they found that men and women, people of different race and ethnicity groups are similar. There's a full range of impulsive and non-impulsive people. And part of also what they're measuring in this one is that they argue that impulsiveness is actually valuable for some jobs and not so good for other jobs. And they're looking to find people to match the job to their behavioral characteristics. But the advantage that they have is going in, they knew that what they were measuring was not going to lead to disparities because they started with only those measures and they focus in only on that. The big question, of course, that they have to answer is whether these are actually valuable characteristics on a basis on which to decide about hiring. So that's still a challenge and a decision that an organization would need to make. They have tried to test and validate that. Another approach is more about sort of how the tool is used. So rather than using it to make decisions about people, it's using it to open up opportunities and give recommendations. So, and the other thing is that this is more about kind of matching skills and what careers people have done. So there still is a risk here that it's going to tell you to follow a career path that is limiting your career path or kind of giving you a stereotypical career path, but it's also leaving it up to you to act on it. And it's focusing in on kind of telling you what you would need to do in terms of training to pursue one career or another. Another tool that I've seen is focusing really in on those job requirements, but what they're trying to do is the problem they're targeting is the poor ability of keyword filters. And saying like, look, when you say you want a job that requires leadership, right now, keyword filters means you have to have leader somewhere on your resume. Well, let's open up that definition of leader. And in particular, one of the examples they talk about is military resume. So somebody who's been a pilot, what are the skills that being a pilot or a commander or lieutenant matches onto, and making sure that those skills get translated rather than having to have the exact keyword. Another is a group that is looking, again, based on academic research that shows that structured behavioral interviews, these are the interviews that say, tell me about a time when this happened and what did you do? The research has shown that those are both a fairer and more predictive way of hiring. And so they're trying to automate that specific process and do some analysis of people's responses, but matching them up to very specific skills. This one is quite narrow, where what they're doing is they've looked at the language used in job postings. And the classic example is software companies that say, we want a coding ninja. And research has shown that if you put coding ninja in there, you're going to get more men applying than women. So what they've done is analyzed how variation in language affects the kind of people and applicants that it attracts, and then analyzes your job posting text and gives you suggestions, right? So it's a small targeted change. And then the last one that I've seen, particularly during the pandemic, is efforts to use skill matching to think about the redeploying workers and displaced workers. So in all of those targeted changes, I think the key thing that's going on is the collaboration between the data scientists and the subject matter expert. I think the initial excitement about machine learning was seen as a province of the data scientists who just thought, all I need to do is dump in the data and the machine will do the work. And I think increasingly there's a realization that is not the most effective way. Input and involvement of users and individuals who are impacted, I think, is important, both in figuring out what change should be targeted, as well as I think a super important thing is that the adoption and implementation is only going to be successful if people are involved in the process of choosing and deciding about tools. The last point I wanted to discuss was something that I learned from from somebody in the project, which I hadn't thought about. People talk about explainability, that they want they want AI systems to be understandable by humans, and that's a good general principle. But what I hadn't appreciated was how important that was for good implementation. And so what we want is we need that explainability so that people use the tool correctly. And within that, we can talk about global explanation and local explanation. So global explanation means how the tool works generally. What are the inputs? What is the outcome? And I think we need to move in a direction where that is much more concrete. Right now, you see these vendors who sell things, and they make these very broad and expansive claims that say, like, we identify high capacity employees. And what I really would like to see is say, we measure this, this, and this about the employees to predict this type of outcome. And that's exactly what this tool is doing, which then gives the human who's using it better guidance on where their instincts, their input, their intuition is needed. Similarly, a local explanation is an explanation for the decision about a specific case. So why was it that this person was recommended? Why was this career recommended? So that, again, one can both understand and make a better action on that, on the output of the system. So to recap on my key takeaways, one is that both the power and the weakness of machine learning systems is they're looking for patterns in real world data. That this kind of this risk of just relying on finding patterns in past data may not be good enough in HR. I think that looking at how we can use AI as a tool for change is going to be a lot more exciting and a lot more effective. Beware of systems that promise magic, that it's unlikely, if we're talking about, does this skill match onto this skill, this text match onto this skill, I think that could be highly accurate, but will this person perform well in the future is unlikely to be highly accurate. The promise is to find hidden patterns. You want to make sure that you're not finding unwanted patterns, and that humble and explained systems are going to lead to better outcomes. So just 2 seconds on the project with the World Economic Forum. The title of the project is Human-Centered AI for HR. And what we've done is created a practical toolkit for HR professionals. So we have a short guide, just a couple pages on each of these topics. So these are the chapters in the guide. So you can see that it's not just focusing on responsible AI and aspects of the tool, but also the organizational practices and policies that are necessary to implement AI in an effective and responsible way. And then what we've done to make it even more practical is create checklists. So on the left was my original thought, which was we have a checklist saying, like, okay, you're thinking about using this particular tool. What are all the things and the questions that you should answer before you go ahead and adopt it? And those are questions not just about the tool, but about your own organizational readiness and what kinds of policies you need to put into place for its use. The other second checklist came out from realizing that many organizations weren't at the point of considering a specific tool yet. And in fact, that is a better position to be in. Maybe we should be thinking about this before we jump into deciding which tool to use. And so the second checklist is the bigger picture. How do we want to use AI? What policies and procedures should we put into place, and that kind of thing. So currently we're piloting the toolkit right now. I mentioned to Pam that we are looking for 1 or 2 more organizations to pilot. If you think that your organization might be particularly interested, it might be possible. I'm not promising because we're just looking for 1 or 2 more, but there'll be in the follow-up email an opportunity to suggest if you're interested. More importantly, we will be launching free to all at the end of the summer, this toolkit. And so you will have an opportunity to see it in action. And then the last thing is, as part of that launch, we're going to be writing a white paper about the state of AI in HR and what we've learned in the piloting. And as part of that, we've created a survey, and in the follow-up email that you'll be getting from this workshop, if you're interested, we'd love to hear about your organization and where your organization is in using AI in HR. So that is it, and ready for a big opening it up for some discussion.
There's been lots going on in the chat there. There was a question earlier on, basically a statement, AI is here to stay. But the question was more, will it only be valuable in the CV screening process as the other steps in the recruitment process require more tangible human components, such as, reference calling, aptitude testing, personality testing, et cetera. And I know you spoke a little bit about that in one of the previous slides, but maybe we can, deepen that.
Yeah, and I think I would say two things. One is to highlight that AI might be useful in many other places besides just recruitment. So one of the chapters in the toolkit is talking about how there's AI tools being developed for the sort of entire employee life cycle, right? So I would say the main, everyone thinks of recruitment, and so I end up going to recruitment as well. But I did highlight, right, there was the tool about sort of career pathing and training. We see things around benefits. Some of it is, there's also a wide variety of kind of levels of risky use, and sort of the lowest risk use, I would say, is our chatbots, which are AI based. But I've seen benefits chatbots that just take away the challenge of answering benefits questions, and you can type in how many vacation days do I have left, right? And it gives you the answer. There are a few workplace planning tools. There are scheduling tools. And there are, which I'm not sure I'm that keen on, remote working monitoring tools, which are a little bit sketchy, right? So one of the key things you want to think about, and one of the big challenges in HR, is the impact on employee trust and organizational culture, and really thinking about, the good old newspaper headline question: if it became public knowledge that you were doing this tool, would you not want people to know? And if that's the case, maybe you should think twice about using it. But thinking about the impact, and it is a big issue, right? We hear people say we don't want to take the human out of HR, and that's definitely true. Although there's some people who argue that humans are not necessarily a big part of HR, that a lot of people get screened out with keyword filters. And also there are people who think that the human is too involved in HR, right? That maybe they're bringing in, there's definitely research that shows that people hire people that they like, which tends to be people who are similar to them. So that's the big challenge, how to balance that very delicate balance. Yeah.
Valerie mentioned that AI is used extensively in systems for succession planning, risk loss, career development tied with learning. Also makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and workforce planning, anticipating. There's also a very common sort of quick tool that many people build is attrition prediction, like who's likely to leave the organization soon. The couple comments I've heard with people say on that is make sure you have an idea of what you're going to do with that, right? So there's two issues. One is, are people going to be spooked out if you go to them and say, our artificial intelligence suggests that you might be leaving soon? Is that a little too weird? And then the second question is, if you have confidence that it's true that they might be leaving soon, what are you going to offer them? What is the value of having that information, and how are you going to keep them if you want to keep them, right? So just having that information may not be that useful.
So having a plan for what you're going to do with the information if you're going to collect it, right?
Exactly.
Roy is asking if you've seen, throughout your experiences, any pushback from employees. And Andre, commented that every time he uses a tool like this, he gets a sigh from a candidate. So, but in your experience, a sigh from a,
Yeah, I mean, the employment screening ones, I mean, the biggest pushback has been, one major company that has been doing video analysis of hiring, and had been making promises about analyzing facial expressions, and including kind of measuring trustworthiness and stuff from your facial expressions. And that was very controversial, had a lot of pushback, although still very widely used. But just in January, they dropped the facial analysis part. So they apparently still analyze tone and then the content of what you say in the interviews. But they went to the point, even a couple of states in the US actually passed laws requiring greater transparency and explainability of video interview, AI and augmented video interviews. I have seen some I saw a Twitter thread from a year or two ago about employees complaining about kind of behavioral assessments and concern about what it was actually measuring, and whether it was really accurate and fair. And also a big thing to highlight, actually, just in the last week, is that that the European Commission has announced its intention to regulate AI, and they're taking a risk-based approach. So what they're saying is they're tiering risk, and the very highest risk is live facial recognition, which I think they're trying to decide whether they're going to ban it completely. But the next tier of risk, I believe, what they're calling high or medium high risk, includes the use of AI in employment. And so they're going to be requiring, a lot of it is actually, from my understanding, I'm talking with the employment lawyers this week on this, but a lot of the onus is going to go onto the technology producers, the vendors. But there is some language in there about the need for the users to be fully informed, and have it has a long paragraph that lays out a lot of what we advocate in the toolkit, but would suggest a certain amount of legal liability if you don't provide that. And some people have argued, how do you fully inform a user about these tools? So there is pushback even at the level of regulation, as well as internal employee pushback. Yeah.
Interesting. And that actually leads to one of the other questions that was in the chat, is do you think that there should be an ethics board that oversees the use of AI in HR?
Yeah, so there's a couple of organizations I've been working with that have been developing, and that's in some ways the motivation for this, having that second checklist, is realizing that companies should be developing kind of standing AI and HR policies, and they should be thinking ahead of time about what do we want to do and what do we not want to do, and not sort of leave it up to kind of ad hoc decisions as a tool. Salesperson comes in your door and wows you with their pitch. But to think a little bit more ahead of time about what you do and don't want to do. And I think, so there's a variety of levels of ethics boards, right? So there are people who are arguing for ethics boards within the technology producers, especially some of the large tech companies. But I think there also is something to be said for your organization, more broadly, if your organization is using AI, to have a broad AI kind of standing group of expertise, but then also for HR-based decisions, making sure that you're bringing in specific people. And that is one of the chapters in the book, is like forming an assessment team and thinking ahead of time about who are all the people who should be involved. That chapter also suggests thinking about putting in like steps and practices and policies. And in some ways, that's what the toolkit is designed to do, is to give you a process for thinking through all the implications. Yeah, but
Andre, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think also that there is there's need for an ethics board, and interestingly, quite a few of the startups are now in agreement. The startups that I've been working with are in agreement of need of regulation. I think for two reasons. One is that they see a lot of sketchy tools out there, and it's a bit of a wild west. And so many of them are making these big grand promises that are very hard to evaluate. They're sort of counting on the ignorance of HR professionals. So they want these kinds of toolkits as well as regulation to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. And I think the other is actually, frankly, that HR is such a highly regulated space that they want more guidance and regulation, because they're seeing some employers don't want to use their tool because they fear lawsuits and stuff. And so if there can be more clarity on the legality, it's actually better for them. So.
Okay, so there's two more questions I see right here. So I'll address the ones that came in first. I'm kind of combining them here. Because Melanie is asking, how does someone who's entering the job market make themselves more marketable? To how some people copy key search parameters and paste them into their resume to kind of beat the bot.
Yeah.
And Roy is saying, what is the potential candidate's right to know which or what type of AI features is being used in their interviews? So I think those two kind of play off each other a little bit.
Absolutely. So on the beat the bot thing, definitely. I mean, I've heard stories about people. I think the AI systems are trying to reduce the ability to game, but the general recommendation for keyword filters is that you should put as many words exactly as they appear in the job description into your resume as possible, because that highlights, especially anything under the required skills. That's sort of to beat the old school keyword system. Yeah, besides that, I think, that is a challenge. And that is one of the questions with the scalability of the AI systems. Like this interviewing system, someone told me, is widely used in finance jobs. And so then you wonder, like, if you just happen to be, even if the system were highly accurate, if you happen to be the kind of odd person where it just didn't work for you, would you be shut out of all finance jobs now because like the same system over and over and over again, no matter where you go? One of the pro AI person in our community argues that humans are equally scalable in their biases, right? Like, humans also from company to company will hold the same biases as well. But I do think that there is a bit of a danger in the algorithms for that. The second, you had what was the other one?
Oh, it's a potential candidate's right to know which type of AI. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's some of what the regulation is about, is notification. In Europe, the GDPR already kind of does that. It talks about the requirement is to collect the data and specify how the data will be used. That Illinois law for the video was similar, required, so you can't surreptitiously use AI. And I think that goes to the headline thing, right? Like, surreptitiously using AI, I think, is a formula for problems, both external reputation as well as internal reputation. The interesting question is that individual local explainability offers the option to explain to individuals why a decision was made about them. And I think for most people, that's a little bit scary. Like, do you really want to tell all the candidates you rejected why they were rejected? And does it raise the possibility of gaming the system? But on the other hand, I think there's many people who think like this is actually one of the benefits of AI. And I've talked to a couple of organizations that have said, you know what, at first we weren't so sure, but increasingly we're realizing that there's a real value and applicants appreciate being told what it was about their resume that was lacking, and actually was a benefit. But I think that transparency is definitely important. Yeah.
Okay, a few more questions coming in. I don't know if we're going to have time for all of them, but we'll try. There's a question about detecting bias. How does one detect bias, or at least negative bias? Not sure that that's possible, it seems.
Yeah, so the systems can be tested. I mean, all of the systems should be tested for bias ahead of time, and they will be testing it on their previous data. One of the challenges is if they're then retraining the algorithm for your specific, if they're customizing to your data, then you need to kind of double check that, because of course the patterns in your data might lead to different outcomes. One of the big challenges is that there was a recent article in Computer Science about how there's 30 different definitions of fairness. So what do we mean by fair is a challenge. Within the employment landscape, there's a little bit more of a legal agreement that it's about disparate impact or adverse impact. So almost all tools in the HR space will test for, especially the US definition of disparate impact, which is this 80% rule. If people are in HR, maybe they'll be knowledgeable of it, but it says that the rate of selection among the applicants has to be 80%. One can't be more than 80% lower than another. And so some people argue that that's actually one of the benefits of these systems, is that they're tested ahead of time and they ensure that you are compliant with that, whereas you're not sure with humans, you're not documenting that. We encourage in the toolkit to have a discussion with the vendors about that process, because I think the real missed opportunity with the Amazon example was that algorithm was telling them something about their company, and they tried to create an automated system to get rid of the bias rather than realizing that maybe they had learned something about their company that needed to be changed. So I encourage people to ask the vendor, did you have to make adjustments? And if so, what were the factors that caused us to make adjustments? And some of the companies are also suggesting changes where they say, like, if you change this, you could have more fair outcomes.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
So what are universities teaching young, HR recruiters or people, young students who want to go into HR on, the use of AI for smart hiring? So I thought that was a good one to end
Yeah,
on.
well, I'm on a mission. I teach a class on people analytics, and in fact, it's part of the business analytics. So I think many of these principles apply to any application, not just HR. And so I actually open the class. It's a bit of a challenge between both our HR majors, where I want them to get the technical savvy, and then our business analytics majors, where I want them to get the kind of responsible and ethical and sort of social implications of stuff, and combine it together into that class. But I think it is something that is beginning to be paid attention to, but needs even more. Yeah.
Right. It will go in that direction further and further.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matissa, and thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate all your comments in the chat and the interaction. And thank you again for helping us understand this complex topic.
Yeah.
So of course, as we mentioned, we'll be sending out a recording after this session, as well as some resources for you. And feel free to send us back an email if you're interested in the pilot, or if you have any questions that were not answered. So we'd love to stay connected. Feel free to add us on LinkedIn and follow more of these level up sessions. The next one will be next Wednesday on burnout and its connection to joy. So that should be interesting as well. All right, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.